The reading quiz next week is on Tuesday. This week it's on Thursday. Yes.
In here or
in your section? Any other questions? All right, well, to begin with, I had neglected in our last class together to bring in an image of the interior of Sainte-Chapelle, which I don't know what happened there. That was an oversight on my part. But I just wanted to remind you quickly before I show that to you that we talked about Sainte-Chapelle as an example of the rayonnant, a kind of evolutionary step in the development of the Gothic. And so remember that we had looked at these nave elevations of a variety of cathedrals and talked about how increasingly over time the buildings got higher, the walls became thinner, and that opened up the possibility for increased glazing, increased window surface there. And remember that there were a number of structural innovations that led to that development. So pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, flying buttresses that took the load away from the wall to progressively lighten the envelope of the building. And so we had talked about Sainte-Chapelle, and the dates are here. We think it was begun after 1238, completed around 1248 when it was consecrated. It was dedicated or commissioned, let's say, by King Louis IX of France, and he commissioned the chapel to house a collection of relics that had been brought back from Jerusalem as a result of the Crusades and other relic trade related to the events associated with the Passion of Jesus. For those of you who don't know what that means, the Passion refers to events leading up to the crucifixion from the time Jesus entered into Jerusalem and was arrested and tortured and then finally crucified. And so physical artifacts that were associated with those events, that they were relics that were acquired by King Louis IX. And this church was built for him near his palace as a almost like a building reliquary. And so this was the bottom level, the lower level of that church. Remember, it was basically intended to accommodate the court, those people surrounding the king himself. And then this is the upstairs of the building, which I think is really quite spectacular, definitely worth a visit if you go to Paris. The windows are not technically floor to ceiling, but that you can see that basically the wall of the building is practically dematerialized on that upper level, completely enclosed by glazing. There is some masonry on the bottom, and it's painted in a way similar to the downstairs level. Highly elaborated. They emphasize this motif of the stylized lily, the fleur-de-lis, which was an emblem of the French royal house. So I just wanted to bring this in. I know it's illustrated in the book, but I just kind of wanted to underline that since that's something that I neglected to bring in last time. We left off talking about Italy, and I had transitioned to a conversation about civic identity, the emergence of city-states after the Peace of Constance, signed with Frederick Barbarossa, and the institutions that developed in Italian cities after the signing of the Peace of Constance in 1183. I really see that as an important point of rupture or a turning point that had implications for architecture and urban planning. We also talked about Saints Francis and Dominic and the rise of the mendicant orders, the urban monastic orders, who took as their mission a very important priority, taking care of urban populations, whether it be clothing the poor and feeding the poor as the Franciscans did, or whether it had to do with educating urban populations about church beliefs, dogma, texts, etc. And that was really the purview of the Dominicans. So the Friars Minor and the preaching friars, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. So I know that you are somewhat familiar with this material, and so I'm going to go a little bit quickly on it, but I just kind of want to use this opportunity to reinforce some important facts, things that I want you to take away in your engagement with the medieval Italian city, because I think they're really important building blocks for reading these places so that you can take these analytical tools and apply them to other cities should you need to. So the first one that we want to talk about is Siena. Siena was actually a fairly small city, pretty powerful, but relatively small, located in north central Italy, not on the water. There was no source of water in Siena. From the earliest times, you know that most cities, it was advantageous to site the city near a source of water. That was kind of one of the first requirements, that if you were going to identify a site for a city, you would want to look for a source of water. That wasn't the case in Siena. They did have wells. They did have a system of aqueducts and conduits for water and so on, but they weren't sited on a river. And this ended up hurting the city in the long run, and economically and socially. So probably not a smart decision. The evolution of Siena that we want to look at, I think this map is very helpful for us. An important determinant for urban form: how do you decide how to lay out a city, how to plan a city? Obviously, institutions play a big role in shaping the identity of the urban form. In the case of Siena, topography played a really big role. The geography of the city, it's organized on 3 ridges. A ridge is sort of like a hill, but it's a long hill. So there are 3 main ridges in the city of Siena, and you can basically see them here in the plan. They're kind of 3 spokes coming out of the center of the city. This is one ridge, another ridge, and a third ridge that goes north. And so these long hilltops were the sites of the earliest development of Siena, and then ultimately the city developed kind of cascading, flowing down those ridges toward the valleys, and eventually that space between the valleys was also filled in. This is a map showing the city around the 14th, 15th century, so the map shows that not completely developed. So the topography is an important organizing element, okay? And it's not just for the urban form. In Siena, in terms of administration, the geography also was key in determining how the city was administered. So the city was divided into thirds. They call them terzi, thirds. And each neighborhood had its own representation and had its own identity. They elected their own representatives. And so the ridges also helped define urban identity in that way, through administrative structures. Interestingly, in Siena, the point where these 3 ridges meet is identified as a kind of neutral zone. In other words, it didn't adhere, it couldn't be appropriated by any of the thirds, any of these neighborhoods. It was neutral. It was a kind of shared space where everyone could come together. And remember that this is really important in this period after the Peace of Constance, because all of these democratic republics were very vulnerable. They were vulnerable because just because the Peace of Constance was signed didn't mean that suddenly everyone agreed and wanted to be equal. Families that had power were still eager to amass that power and overturn the republic. So it was very fragile. And so they had to make decisions that would reinforce this Republican, democratic identity for the city. So the site of that central site, which was the location of the main civic institutions, was not casually identified. It was really important in terms of maintaining or kind of defining this commitment to the Republican city. This is also a great plan because it reminds you of the importance of the city wall. The city wall obviously defines the separation between the community that is inside the city walls and outside the city walls. Interestingly enough, urban historians talk about the wall obviously as a defensive technology. The wall is the thing that keeps the people inside safe from people outside who would want to attack the city and take it over, which actually happened in Siena in the 16th century. They were taken over by the Florentines. But that's not all it is, and I think that's important to know too. Cities were complex economic entities, and the walls, and especially the gates in the walls, served as places where movement of goods, movement of trade was monitored and controlled. Taxes were assigned when people came in. They brought imported goods. Think about, ports today, or even cargo, airport cargo today. All of that stuff that comes into the country is monitored, taxed, documented. That happened at the city gates. So they were places of economic importance for the city. In addition, I want you to understand, and I have some images that I'll be showing you in a minute to kind of reinforce this point. It's important to understand that the city depended on the country around it. Usually in the city, people might have like a small space where they could grow some vegetables or herbs or something like that, but it's not like there were large-scale gardens inside the city usually, unless they were related to monasteries. Private people didn't have gardens where they could sustain themselves. That all came in from outside. And so the city really did rely on the country, on the countryside, the people on the countryside, and those people in the countryside associated with the city. So there was this symbiotic relationship between them that the wall disguises. The wall gives this impression of an absolute separation which didn't exist in fact. Okay, so those are the kind of general components of the city. The wall, the gates, the organization according to the topography, and this focus on this central node, which is the civic center. Interestingly, in Siena, remember last time we were talking about the Franciscans and the Dominicans and how they're almost like a medieval or Renaissance social services network. Because of that, and also because they were in competition with one another for financial support from people in the city, it's typical to find them in different locations within the city. And I'm saying opposite sides of the city. And so here in Siena, I want you to take a look at this. 7, the site that is labeled 7 here, that's San Domenico, that's the Dominican house. And over here, number 8, that's the Franciscan house. And so you can see that they're in different thirds of the city. They associate with their own neighborhood. It's not to say that people from all over the city couldn't go to these places. I have to tell you, it's a pretty small town. You can walk from end to end easily. But it's symbolic, or it's reflective of their different identities, that they would end up in different parts of the city. And you can see there are other monastic sites. Number 9 here, Sant'Agostino, dedicated to St. Augustine. The Servi, number 10, they're sort of more associated with the Franciscans. So there were urban monastic groups. They were somewhat territorial. They didn't want to encroach on each other's territory. If you go to any Italian town, you can read very easily this formula, I would say, or kind of urban typology or morphology that kind of tells you about the organization of these institutions. You can find the Civic Center, the Dominicans will be on one side of town, the Franciscans will be on the other side of the town. If you ever find that it's different, please write to me and let me know. I've never seen a case where they're not kind of separated across the city. So, Siena, has this emblematic, very powerful, strong urban center right in the middle in that neutral zone that I was talking about. It profits from its geographical condition, not just because it's at the center of the city, but also because it's a site that happens to be kind of bowl form. There's almost like a natural amphitheater type shape here, and you can see it reinforced in this kind of shell-shaped outline of the square. Note that we refer to the square when it appears in Italy, we refer to that as a piazza. And so the piazza here kind of takes advantage of that natural amphitheater shape. They've paved it, and they use the stone detailing to kind of focus your attention on a central point in front of the main town hall. This is the town hall, and we want to talk a little bit about the kind of typology of town hall architecture and the elements that we typically see in these town halls throughout Italy. And this is also a great slide to kind of emphasize the separation between the secular, in other words, the non-religious institutions, and the religious institutions. This is the cathedral over here. So you can kind of see they're separated, they're kind of connected by an artery or an armature between these two nodes, but each institution kind of has its independence in this layout. The piazza, we tend to associate it with civic functions because it is it's adjacent to the town hall. But, and I think the video kind of gives this idea a little bit. There is a definite overlapping of the civic and the secular in urban life. And so even though those institutions appear through their site to be separated, and as institutions they are separate, in everyday life, in people's minds, everything is religious, everything is civic. It all kind of combines together. And I love this particular image from the 15th century, which shows the piazza in front of the Sienese town hall, where an important preacher from Siena, his name is Bernardino of Siena, you see him here, he's standing in front of the town hall giving a sermon in public. He uses that civic square for a religious purpose, and those two things really overlap, and they're very, very important. So one thing that I also love this view for is that it gives us an idea about how people, not just how people use the space, but how they organize themselves within the space. So it's important to note that during this period, men and women were separated at religious events. So there's this curtain that separates the women who are on the left here from the men who are on the right. And there are town fathers organized on this sort of platform in the front, and Bernardino is giving this sermon. So it's definitely the case that the piazza, as you can kind of maybe think of it as a stadium in some ways, it's a place where people come together for all kinds of public functions. This image is also good. It maybe gives us a chance to understand key components of the building type. Remember that are you guys with us over there? It's very distracting. The main components of the building are intended to communicate the Republican identity, the kind of democratic functions of the city. And so think about it sort of from the ground up. It's a building that is definitely fortified. It has a very strong it gives a very strong impression and gives a kind of idea of authority and power. But it also, especially on these upper zones, because of these this consistent pattern of windows, wants to indicate that they're not hiding anything. They want to defend it, But they're also, they want their work, their deliberations, their decisions, they want them to be transparent. And this is maybe a symbolic gesture, but it's a way of using architecture to communicate the way the building is intended to function, the identity of their institutions. So yes, on one hand, it has a kind of fortified quality with these, especially at the bottom, you know, where it's very heavy in terms of the stone masonry on the bottom, but also at the top. It has these features, these blocks that project at the top, which are called crenellations. That's a vocabulary word that appeared early on in this semester. And crenellations were a defensive mechanism where if you had to defend the city hall, the town hall, you could hide behind them and shoot people below. And so they read as a kind of language of defense. Other elements that are included here, which are typical of the town hall, it's cut off in this image, but we saw it in the previous slide, is the bell tower. When we're talking about a bell tower in Italy, we sometimes see the word campanile, C-A-M-P-A-N-I-L-E. It's not that I expect to turn you all into Italian speakers, but these words have entered into the English lexicon. So campanile, C-A-M-P-A-N-I-L-E, campanile. And the campanile is an important feature. It serves the function of ordering the day. It rings for the hours of the day. Remember that this is a time when clocks and watches didn't really exist. Clocks existed, but they were very rare. And so the bell of the bell tower was very significant as a sort of public address system. And the bell would ring in different ways to communicate different kinds of urban events. So one way to ring it, if you've ever seen a bell hanging, and it swings once you strike it. So if you ring it in that way, it actually echoes back on itself and it starts to ring in an irregular way. If you just pull a cord and the bell starts ringing. If I can remember, I'll try to bring in a video of it, or at least post it on the Blackboard page. So when it rings, it starts to echo back on itself, and it becomes kind of irregular. Another way to ring it is to hold the bell and just strike it in a steady rhythm. All of these subtle differences in the way you ring the bell were, people understood that mode of communication and they could tell what was happening. Maybe one signal inferred or communicated that the city was being attacked. Maybe it communicated that there was a fire. Maybe it communicated that a criminal was going to be executed in the square. Maybe it communicated that legislators were coming out into the square to make an announcement. There were many, many different ways, rhythms, approaches to ringing those bells, and the campanile was the sort of public address system. Really, really important in terms of ordering the activity of the people in the city. And of course, we know that churches also had campanile. They had bell towers, and those bells were kind of in competition with or in communication with the civic bell at the town hall. And so it was a kind of oral or soundscape that was driven by architecture, but it was organized by your sense of hearing. So this is the exterior, obviously with some scaffolding on the front of it. You see the three-part organization of the facade of the building with this extra space at the top, this kind of point of hierarchy, which is a more private counselor meeting space. The campanile obviously is very prominent. The height of the campanile is significant when approaching Siena, regardless of what direction you're coming from. You can see it from really, really far away. It's very distinctive in its form, this brick. and stone at the top, so it's easily identifiable. Usually towns attempted to design and build a campanile that was unique to its own, to the city itself, so they could identify it as being associated with them. At the base of this campanile, there is this kind of porch. That porch is called a loggia, L-O-G-G-I-A, and it was a kind of like a civic stage. It was a place where legislators could gather for special occasions and make announcements. Most Italian town halls have a loggia. Sometimes it's attached, sometimes it's detached, associated with a civic center. So I mentioned that there are a couple of organizing elements in Italian cities. We talked about the topography, we talked about the walls, the major institutions. Another aspect that you can read in the urban environment that can tell you about the historical past of a city without even having to read a book or a plaque or a guidebook or tourist information or anything like that. You can definitely identify something important about the city's past by just looking at the street pattern. And so many cities in Italy, and we're going to look at the example of Florence in a second, follow the model of the Roman castrum plan. That's something that we saw back when we were looking at the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. The castrum plan is a grid. So if you see a city that has at its center a regularized grid form, you know it was founded by the Romans. Okay? We're talking about Italy specifically here. If you don't see that pattern, it's probably likely that the city was not founded by the Romans. However, as you know from the reading, increasingly over this period, cities wanted to claim a connection to Rome. Why would they want to claim a connection to Rome? Well, they wanted to share in the reputation for administration, the reputation for highly developed culture, the reputation of power and wealth, all of that. So the idea was that they wanted to claim an association with Rome. Well, Siena didn't have that. So they didn't have that, so they fabricated it. They came up with a legend that said that Siena was actually founded by the children of the mythological founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. And so I'm going to go back to this view here. I know it's really small. I don't know if you can make it out on the screen. There's this sculpture here in the background. That is a view of the Madonna and Child. You see the Madonna and Child everywhere in Siena. The other image that you see all the time in Siena is an image that reflects the Roman past, and that is a wolf and two children suckling the wolf, at the wolf. And remember, this is a symbol of Rome, that goes all the way back to the idea of Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, the mythological children who eventually grew up and founded the city of Rome. So Siena appropriates this image and basically claims this connection. They also use this connection in shaping their coat of arms. A coat of arms is a shield. You might think of it almost like a logo. It's a symbol that whenever you see it, it represents the city. So cities have coats of arms. Families have coats of arms. It's like a symbol that identifies the person, family, or institution, or place. And so here you're seeing the detail from the facade of the town hall. The shield is white on the top and black on the bottom. And it's because this foundation legend of these children of Romulus and Remus says that they left Rome, they traveled to Siena, and during the day, they were protected overhead by a white cloud, and at night, they were protected by a black cloud. And so it's pretty abstract, I'll admit, it's pretty abstract, but it's intended to kind of, in the minds of the Sienese, remind them of their connection to Rome, the fact that they see themselves literally as the heirs of Rome. So wherever you see the shield, you can see that it's a point of civic pride. It's kind of them reminding the citizenry of this connection. Before I leave the building, are there any questions on any of that I just, the urban form, the town hall typology? No. So on the interior of the building is decorated on the interior with frescoes. There were meeting rooms inside the building, and this main meeting room has images that are allegories. These allegories are intended to make a message to the legislators, reminding them of virtues that are important for good government and vices that could threaten the city. So on one wall, there's an allegory or the effects of good government, and on the opposite wall is an allegory of bad government. And it tells you what's going to happen if you don't govern according to these virtues. And then on the back wall here are allegorical figures, representations, symbolic figures referring to justice. And the idea is that a civilized society must be governed by the rule of law in order for the city to remain stable, for there to be a sense of trust, and prosperity, of course, but that this fragile Republican rule really depended on people acting ethically, morally, and according to these virtues and justice. So just some details here. This image is a detail of the allegory of good government, and it shows you what happens in a city where things are running smoothly, where you can count on the legislators to be moral and ethical and concerned always with not just the fact of morality and virtue, but the execution of it. So, the perception of it. So it's the execution of morality, but also the perception of it, which allows everyone to live in a situation of prosperity and trust and stability and safety. So this is very easily identifiable as the city of Siena, because back here in the corner is a detail, and we'll look at it in a minute, of the Cathedral of Siena. It doesn't look like any other cathedral in Italy. You can identify it absolutely immediately. So we know that we're looking at the city of Siena. It brings the message home to the legislators. In the city, for example, there is active trade. There's fair trade going on. You don't see anyone irate because they're being cheated. Over here, there is a detail that shows a professor at a podium looking at students who are listening and being lectured to. The idea is that in a just, good society, people are educated and can be educated participants of the society. This is an example here of what I was telling you before about that symbiotic relationship of the city and the country, that people from the country bring their wares into the city to sell them. And that's certainly what's happening here. This shepherd is bringing the sheep in probably to sell them or maybe to have them butchered. All over the city there are these details that show you what a well-run city might look like. And I think this is an interesting detail up here, showing this tower where people are building. In a stable society that's economically viable, that is not busy worrying about war or conflict, you're busy building toward the future rather than tearing things down. Here's another detail just to give you a little bit of a better sense of the fabric of the building, of the city, and how it's organized. I told you that this is a fresco, so that there are parts of the work that have flaked off the surface of the wall, so there are parts of it that are blank. But you kind of get the overall sense of the fabric of the city and the different people who play a role in making the city work. This is the detail from the allegory of bad government, and so I don't know if you can see this devilish looking character here with the horns, and all of his sort of soldiers are out doing his evil bidding, and people are being dragged through the streets by their hair. Justice here is shown bound up, incapable of exercising its power in this unjust society. And of course, there are inscriptions on the bottom. In these quatrefoil panels here at the bottom, there were images representing virtues. Some of them have been abraded and flaked off since its inception, but this kind of gives you an idea of the kind of pictorial language of the space. And this was really important. This visual rhetoric was a reminder to the people who met here to always keep in mind the consequences of their actions. They were compelled not to only think of their own power, their own wealth, their own gain, but to remember that they were servants of the city. And these images kind of reinforce that, not just from a civic point of view, but also saying, basically, if you don't follow through on this, there are going to be consequences in the afterlife. The idea was that virtue was an extension of your religious faith. So speaking of this, here is an image of the cathedral. Remember that in Italy, when we refer to a cathedral, we call it a Duomo. The Duomo is not a dome, it's not a church, it refers specifically to the cathedral. And so we've already been through the distinction between a cathedral and a church. Just like in France, when we were looking at Gothic cathedrals, it's the same in Italy. Usually the site of the cathedral is going to be in a prominent place. If it's not in the city center, it will be in a prominent location that is at least high, that gives them enough space to build on a significant scale. That's certainly the case in Siena. This church, you can even see here from this view, you can kind of see the landscape cascading away from the Duomo, which is situated on the height, a high point. Here's the front of the building, and you'll notice, I was telling you earlier about this overlapping of the civic and the religious. When I look at the cladding of this church, I really see a kind of abstraction of the city's coat of arms. This white and black striping is basically an envelope where the whole cathedral is wrapped in the civic identity. Some Italians from other cities jokingly refer to this as Our Lady of the Zebra, because it's, this striping is very particular to Siena. The cathedral obviously is a point of pride. You wanted your cathedral to be a noteworthy structure. You wanted to display your piety. You wanted to display your wealth. You wanted to display your structural and creative ingenuity. And so the Sienese participated in a kind of, it's not an organized competition, but it was sort of a kind of figurative competition between cities who could have the most elaborate developed cathedral, and they decided that they were going to expand their building. So in order to do this, they decided to keep the original building and at a 90-degree angle build a new nave, and that's what you're seeing here. So this is the church. This part of the original church was going to be transformed into a transept, and the nave of the building was going to be here. The whole project was interrupted when the plague came to town in 1348. Siena was decimated by the plague, also known as the Black Death. The population was devastated. And in addition, the city government went through a crisis where it had to dissolve and reform. And so the mid-14th century, when this building was being constructed, was a time of significant crisis in Siena. And so the nave never got completed. And it remains there. It's almost like a fossil, or like a kind of like a grave marker almost of what happened in the 14th century when these people died. Here's the interior of the building. You can see that the stripes continue on the inside. And this cladding, it makes a very strong impression on the interior. You can see through to the crossing of the cathedral where the transepts and the nave meet. So that alternation of that striping obviously continues that notion or that representation of the civic coat of arms. Any questions on Siena before we move to Florence? So Florence, obviously you guys are familiar with Florence as well, both from the reading and the video. This aerial view of the city, I think, communicates really nicely what I was referring to earlier. Florence didn't have to fabricate its Roman roots. It was actually founded by the Romans in the 1st century as a kind of retirement community for military leaders. You see the grid of the castrum plan very, very clearly in the middle of the city. Remember that in Roman cities like Pompeii, for example, you had 2 main arteries, the north-south artery, the Cardo. You had an east-west artery or street, north-south street, the Cardo, the east-west street, the Decumanus. And at the intersection of those 2 major streets, you had the Forum. The Forum was, in ancient times, the Forum was a marketplace. It was a place of civic institutions where government was conducted. Sometimes there would be temples. You can even read in the urban plan of Florence these major streets, the Decumanus going east to west, the Cardo going north to south, and the intersection where the Forum is, okay? So this Roman past is very strongly visible, you can experience the grid in the main center of the city, but it continued to grow. So eventually, the Roman walls were destroyed. You can even see the next circuit of walls here. And then the next circuit of walls here. So you can see that there's this kind of ripple. As the city grew and expanded, they would destroy a circuit of walls and then continue to build and fill that in. So Florence was extremely wealthy, very much driven by its economy and trade. Florence was famous for production of wool. It was famous for the production of silk. There was a huge network of bankers, highly evolved, very complex, mercantile economy in the city of Florence. Very, very wealthy. And ultimately a very dense, very developed city. The other thing that this view allows us to see really, really clearly is not just the circuit of walls and the kind of Roman past, but the major institutions. So I'm just going to orient you here really quickly. This is the main civic center. This is the main religious center at the top of the grid. So they're kind of within that historic center. Over here is the Dominican monastery or friary, and over here is the Franciscan one. So just like I was telling you, you can see that those 2 monastic institutions go to opposite sides of the city and begin to associate with those neighborhoods so that they don't compete with one another. So here again, just pointing out the castrum plan, the intersection of the Cardo and the Decumanus at the Forum from the Roman period. In addition, the Palazzo Vecchio, which was the old town hall, the Duomo being the cathedral, and the baptistry being the place where Christians went through the ritual of baptism that sort of initiated them into Christianity, and the Dominican Friary and the Franciscan Friary. So we want to start by talking about the Duomo, the cathedral, and this is a kind of zoomed-in view of the cathedral and the baptistry. They're really two separate buildings. And like I was saying, the cathedral was an opportunity for the city to express itself, to assert its piety and devotion, its sort of Christianity, also its wealth. They would pour a ton of resources into the building. And also, obviously, it's the city's ingenuity, its cleverness, its artistic side. And the Cathedral of Florence was definitely a place where all of those things kind of came together. The baptistry predates the cathedral that is there today. Typical of the Florentines, they wanted to say, there are actually legends that say that this building was founded by the Romans. It was actually Carolingian. It was associated with the reign of Charlemagne when he came into Italy and built churches all over the Italian peninsula to kind of reinforce his presence there. This is a building that on the exterior, you see that this building is striped too. And when you look at the kind of paneling or the veneer of the exterior of this building, you could be forgiven if you said, well, I thought this was Florence. Why do they have striping and Siena has striping? It's a subtle difference. It doesn't really read very well on the slide. But in Florence, they use a patterning that is white and green marble rather than white and black marble, which is what you see in Siena. And so this, the exterior of the building is extremely ornate, and this is a site which has civic connotations, because every year the baptistry on a specific day, the beginning date of the Florentine New Year, they would bring the babies that were born and have them baptized together in the baptistry building, thereby making them, not just initiating them into Christianity, but initiating them into life as Florentine citizens. This is the interior. That Carolingian past comes through on the interior, where you see these cycles of mosaic scenes. Most of these images refer to Old Testament scenes. So the kind of focus on the ancient as a precursor to the modern, that informed the selection of the decorative cycle on the inside. The doors of this building bring us into the 14th century, when we have an opportunity to talk about a new model of patronage. So, generally speaking, throughout the semester so far, mainly we've talked about how institutions serve as patrons. So maybe it's the city, maybe it's the church. Sometimes we have been able to say a king, an emperor was the patron of a building. But in Florence during this period, in particular, they assigned the maintenance of buildings to trade guilds. A trade guild is almost like a trade union. It's an organization of people who come together based on their profession. So there was a guild for wool workers. There was a guild for wool merchants. There was a guild for bankers and notaries. There was a guild for pharmacists. Whatever your profession was, there was usually a guild or a union that you could join that kind of controlled and regulated trade within the city. And the city assigned responsibility for its major monuments to these guilds. It wasn't a public works project where the city would go around and, aside from the town hall, and maintain major monuments. This was the job of the guild. And so the baptistry was the responsibility of the Cloth Merchants Guild, and that tells you how powerful the Cloth Merchants Guild was. Cloth, the sale of cloth, the fabrication of textiles in Florence was a huge driver of their economy. And so to assign to them a building as important as the baptistry tells you how significant that guild was. And in the 14th century, they got this idea that they wanted to beautify the baptistry by producing a set of monumental bronze doors. And so they do this. They commission a sculptor named Andrea Pisano, and they have this decorative door frame, and the doors themselves are panels that represent scenes from the life of John the Baptist. This is a Christian story about the figure who ultimately baptized Jesus and initiated Jesus's period of preaching in public. And so each one of these panels represents a scene from the life of John the Baptist. Those panels are produced separately, and then they're constructed. They're kind of attached together on the doors. And you can see that at the corner of each of these panels, you can see that there's like this little knobby figure here. Those knobs are lions' heads. The lion head, as it's represented in Florence, is known as the Marzocco. And so I think it's instructive. The Marzocco has no religious meaning at all. It's only a representation of the fierceness and the power of the city of Florence. And this is a great example, again, of how the religious and the secular overlap. The visual language of that is very fluid. And you can see that this one has been touched a lot. It's considered good luck to touch the nose of the Marzocco. So you can see that a lot of people have touched the nose of this particular one. Here's a detail of one of the panels. These panels, they're very early in the history of the baptistry doors. There would, after this set of doors, be 2 additional sets of doors that were produced later in the Renaissance. Again, kind of showing a chronology of the evolution of technique and artistic theory. This is the earliest set, and so it's pretty flat. The figures are kind of applied to the surface of the panel. We've got John the Baptist here. He's usually represented in a very rough kind of hair cloth. His beard is long because he's been living like a hermit out in the wilderness somewhere. And he comes to the River Jordan and he baptizes Jesus. Here's the bowl. He takes water from the river and pours it over his head. And the attendance of the angel and the Holy Spirit in the form of the dove is said to come down and kind of cosmically, mysteriously transform Jesus. And you can tell that it's a fairly early rendition. I love how here it's basically a section of the river. The river looks almost like a skirt. They're not really sure how to resolve the representation of the river. They kind of want to show that his body is in the water. So in later representations of the baptism, if you see them in art or even in sculpture, they tend to be more sophisticated. But I always kind of get a kick out of this section of the river, which is looks almost like a towel or something. So beside the baptistry, which is obviously an important monument for the Florentines, and a great emblem or example of their patronage structure, just beside it is the cathedral. Now, there had been a cathedral on the site long before the 13th and 14th century campaign for the Duomo. You can see that these are progressive structures that are ultimately torn down, and a new, more expanded cathedral is initiated in the 13th century according to a project by the architect Arnolfo di Cambio. And over time, it continued to be developed, expanded. You can see that there's a long nave. There's a very strongly legible cruciform with a crossing between the transepts and the nave. Ultimately, what happened is this project goes up in the way that we described. They begin in the east end, they extend to the west end, the walls come up, and they reach the top level of the structure, and they have this huge gaping hole at the crossing. It's an enormous diameter, and they have a big problem because structurally they do not know how to complete the dome. Concrete had fallen out of regular practice. Building a concrete dome was no longer an option. In the intervening years between the Roman Empire and the 1300s, the 1400s, people fell out of the habit of using concrete, and so it wasn't an option. People went to Rome to study what was at that time the largest surviving dome, which was the Pantheon. Obviously, it was made out of concrete, and you guys all know that the fact of it being made out of concrete was critical to the accomplishment of that construction. So if you don't have concrete, what are you going to do? In addition, they had a problem because the opening was so large. How do you build a scaffolding? How do you build a centering to make an arch and then a dome that size? So they had big, big problems. And they initiated a competition to try to figure out, to kind of attract ideas for how to do this. They were so desperate, because imagine how embarrassing it would have been to have this big hole, and not be able to complete it. So they were so desperate at one point, there's even a story that somebody suggested that they fill the Duomo with sand, laced with gold coins, so that the workmen could stand on this pile of sand and construct the dome. And then because it had coins in it, they could call in the people, and the people would dig out the sand for them to get the gold coins. Completely absurd and desperate. So at the end of the day, all these various architects come to present their ideas, and ultimately they decided to hire Filippo Brunelleschi. But he had to work with another sculptor, architect from the time, Lorenzo Ghiberti, and they collaborated. Ultimately, they had a really hard time working together. Ghiberti was dismissed from the job, and Brunelleschi completed it himself. He initiated some pretty significant innovations, not just for the building of the dome, but just for the construction process. If you're ever interested in reading a truly interesting account of this process, there's a book by a guy named Ross King. He's a popular writer. He's not an architectural historian in the proper sense, but he wrote this popular book called Brunelleschi's Dome, and he describes Brunelleschi's invention, really, of all kinds of mechanical systems that allow them to create pulleys that would move, allow them to bring construction materials up and down, and even to allow the workers to bring their lunches up to them so that they wouldn't have to go up and down the scaffolding all day. It was an enormous, enormous effort. So what are the technologies that Brunelleschi devises to produce this dome, very tall dome, but to allow it to be very light and give it this monumental profile in the landscape? So this is a view that kind of tells you a little bit about the structure. He builds a kind of internal scaffolding. It's kind of a honeycomb. You can see that it's a grid with these openings to kind of lighten the structure. And he creates two domes, an outer dome and an inner dome, very, very light, and kind of reinforces the ribs with stone. Very important to his method was a brick pattern. The way that he laid the bricks was critical to the integrity of the dome. You can see this here. Rather than laying the bricks in horizontal courses, in kind of rings around the dome, which he thought would make it structurally vulnerable, he made this interlocking pattern of bricks. This is called a herringbone pattern. Herring are fish. You can kind of see that they kind of connect together. Herringbone, Herringbone, herringbone. And this shows you how the space between the two domes. There's actually a passageway that allows for maintenance so that you can go up and down between the domes. Today, if you go to Florence, you can still today climb up into the dome and walk between the dome. You walk up around the crossing, as you see here. You're sort of at this level, and then you enter in between the shelves. It's not for the faint of heart. And one other thing that he did that kind of was intended to reinforce or stabilize the structure is on the inner dome, on the outside of the inner dome, in other words, on this face here that we're seeing, he deployed a system of chains, really heavy chains. He called it a girdle that he hoped would keep the whole thing together in case the walls tried to buckle out. So there was a variety of techniques that he used. And the main thing, though, I think that is most important in terms of the construction process, of course, they did not have scaffolding. And so he devised a process that allowed them to cantilever platforms projecting from the constructed rings of the dome, so it grew, the platform would rise as the walls of the dome rose. So this was a kind of ingenious, I think, construction method. The logistics of the construction were as important as the structure itself, and I think that's really important to remember here. The dome, as this image suggests, this building is like, I mean, I can't really describe how monumental it is and the impact that it makes on the urban environment. I think this image tells you a little bit about its scale and how it looms over the entire city. After it was constructed, it really put Florence on the map as a center of artistic and architectural invention and ingenuity and creativity. The theorist and architect Alberti wrote about the Florence Cathedral that it placed all of Tuscany in its shadow. And he really meant that figuratively, in the sense of it's so big that it casts its shadow over a great distance. But he also meant it in the sense that it allowed Florence to dominate, to really put everyone else in its shadow as a center of creativity. The Duomo is this kind of emblem of that identity. You can see that there's a part of it that's not completed. There was meant to be a kind of stone, you can kind of see a portico around the outside of the dome. They started this construction, and Michelangelo referred to it as a cricket's cage. He felt like it was, it ruined the building, and based on Michelangelo's critique of it, they stopped the whole project. So it remains uncompleted, and a lot of the cladding on the facade is 19th century, so it was continued to be built over time, but the dome remains the major achievement of the building. The Duomo is connected by means of an important street to the main civic center. This is the Palazzo Vecchio, the town hall. You can see that these two powers reside independently, at least how they are viewed in the urban environment. Obviously, I've been trying to complicate that view by showing you how the civic and the religious overlap. Just quickly before we finish today, I want to tell you about, or remind you about the typology of the town hall. The siting of the town hall, we said, is often in a neutral zone. It's often in the center of the city. In the case of Florence, the town hall was actually sited based on an event where the democracy was threatened. You know that I said earlier that it was just sometimes the case that even though you were in a city republic that was democratic and republican, sometimes wealthy families would get the idea that they wanted to claim power and overthrow the democracy. Well, this happened in Florence. There was a family named the Uberti family, and this is their coat of arms. The Uberti family tried to work with allies and take over power and topple or cancel the democratic government. Well, when this started to happen, the people of the city rebelled against the Uberti. They exiled them, which means that they threw them out of the city, and for good measure, they demolished their house so that they could never come back. And then they built their town hall on top of that site. So this is a great example of how site maintains associations. The associations may not be visible to you, but sometimes sites have this kind of embedded history that is meaningful to the people who build there. So really quickly, a couple of the aspects of the town hall typology that we see at work here at the Palazzo Vecchio. The kind of fortified lower zone on the bottom. You can see that this building is built out of a very heavy stone. The heaviness and the rustication of that stone is meant to communicate the power of the building. Also defensive elements, the crenellations that we saw at Siena, are at the top of the building. One additional feature, you can see that at the top of the building, there is this space that kind of projects out from the body of the building, right? These are called machicolations. And basically, it's a hallway, an open gallery space that projects from the body of the building. It's inhabitable by forces, soldiers, who, if the building is attacked, they can open a door that opens into the bottom of those archways there and they can either shoot arrows down from there or they can pour boiling oil down from there. And if you go to Venice today and you get up close to the building and you look up, you can actually see the doors in the bottom of these machicolations. This was not just a rhetoric or a symbol of defensiveness. This thing was built to defend. Okay. You also see the importance of the campanile here, dominating the square. The use of windows to suggest the open spaces on the interior of the building where these elected legislative bodies would gather. And really important to the town hall typology is its siting on the piazza. There has to be an open space where the people can gather and make their wishes known, or where the legislators can come out and make announcements for the people. So as you can see, Siena's, they have a lot of the same elements, these town halls, but they're articulated in ways that are particular to their local context. So that means local material, kind of local detailing, using a local language, architectural language for windows and other elements like doorways and so on. So obviously the town hall in Florence looks a little bit different from the one in Siena. Here's a plan just to give you an idea. On the interior, the spaces are a little bit more chaotic than the exterior would indicate. That exterior looks very unified, homogeneous. On the interior, it's a little bit more chaotic. But you can kind of make out some of these large meeting spaces where the various governing bodies would collect together and make decisions, obviously broken down into committees, and there are smaller bureaucratic spaces in the back that were built at a later period. Next to the Palazzo Vecchio is this building. This is Loggia. We looked at the Loggia in Siena. It was just a one-bay structure built in white stone. Here in Florence, we see the Loggia, it's called the Loggia dei Lanzi. The Florentine Loggia is obviously much bigger than the one in Siena. Today, it kind of functions almost like a sculpture gallery. You might see in this view, there are a lot of sculptures in there. At the time, it would have been open. It would have been a kind of stage for legislators at the time of important civic rituals like processions or other celebrations. So we're out of time, so you'll meet in your sections on Thursday. You'll work on your papers. Don't forget to look at the Blackboard page for the outline guidelines, and then we'll look at some architectural theory on Tuesday related to the